before you. One by one we will take you.
I guess we're doing a top 5.
We are. It's a top 5.
Well, actually, David, it's a top 10 because there's 2 of us, and you're doing sci-fi, and I'm doing horror.
And we can multiply. So, yes. And I'm excited. This was kind of a neat idea. This was just a throw out that we did, and said, hey, okay, pick a year, boom, random, here you go.
Totally agree. Before we start, I just wanted to preface this by saying something we don't say enough. That if you're new to us or watch any of our other shows or just finding us, we are old friends.
Yes.
That have really not lived in the same state for 35 years.
Basically.
We started doing these podcasts a few years back, and we do them remotely via Zoom, and we do them unscripted, and we just basically come into them blind and see what each other has to think about a certain topic that we've given each other maybe a week prior or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's how this works, folks.
That's
so
how
if
we work.
Stammer or look like idiots, it's because we don't have a script. It's just us.
We're making this up as we go.
There you go.
Yep.
So what is our topic for the top 5 today, Mr.
We just said pick a random year. Landed on 1983. And we are going to do the top 5, in our opinion, movie releases of that year. You're going to do 5 in horror. I'm going to do 5 in science fiction. It was difficult for me. I had like 6 honorable mentions. I had to cut back and down and change and everything. I was amazed that there's some fun stuff there.
There's some fun stuff. I don't know if I would call it great stuff as far as my genre is concerned.
No, I agree with that. Like my honorable mentions, I needed to mention because I think they are notable names. Not that they're good movies at all, but people will remember them.
Remember them. Exactly.
Yes.
That's what I was thinking. I was trying to think of landmarks that happened in 1983, and the first thing I can think of is it was the year Thriller came out on video.
John Landis directed. It had that huge... the bookends, the beginning and the end that they ended up trimming off on MTV later on just to make the whole video run shorter. But all the makeup effects, didn't Rob Bottin do the makeup? I think he did. I think he did.
It may have been him. It could have been Rick Baker. I can't remember.
Oh, it's one of the others. One of those two.
All I remember is Vincent Price saying, terrorize y'all's neighborhood.
Y'all's neighborhood. Yeah.
And the soul for getting down.
Well, it had, monsters climbing out of graves and werewolf effects. And, it had some genuine, cool, scary stuff at that beginning and ending.
Absolutely. Great dance number, too. I mean, everything about it's iconic.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It was great. So while that was going on, there were horror and science fiction movies going on.
Several of which we probably watched on videotape together.
And I'll start.
I'll start too.
Number 5 for me is Blue Thunder. Is it a science fiction film? Yes, it actually is. It was an original screenplay written by Dan O'Bannon. I did not know that until I started researching it. And it's basically Roy Scheider and a futuristic helicopter. This helicopter has stealth mode, so you never hear it. It has all these advanced weapons. It has almost an AI to it, not really, but a very advanced computer inside it. And then it gets into huge, police brutality, espionage sort of thing. It was directed by John Badham, who we've covered a few times on the podcast, and he's pretty cool. He was very big in the 80s as war games and stuff like that, and ended up grossing $42 million on a $6 million budget. So this was a pretty big hit for them.
Okay. I remember that movie, but I don't know that I ever saw it.
I liked it. I watched it a couple of times in the theater. I liked the aerial photography of it, of course, with the helicopters and all of that. But that was my number 5, Blue Thunder, 1983.
Blue Thunder. Well, over on the horror side, my number 5 is a little Canadian slasher movie called Curtains.
Ooh, I don't think I've ever seen that, but I've heard of it.
Well, we used to watch it on video a lot. I'm not sure if you were with me. It starred Samantha Eggar, who we know from another Canadian movie, The Brood, David Cronenberg, roughly the same time, and John Vernon. He plays kind of a pompous movie director. I can't remember exactly how he plays out, but he coaxes his lead, Samantha Eggar, to go into an asylum for research purposes.
Of course.
And she basically ends up getting stuck there while he starts auditioning other young starlets for the role. Eventually, a masked murderer shows up and starts killing these young starlets. Do you remember?
I do. I think
I see that look in your face. He wore this
do.
really creepy mask with long blonde hair. And there's a scene where one of them is ice skating. And in slow motion, this man in this horror, I can't remember if it's a man or a woman, whoever the killer is, I think it's a man, but it looks like a woman, is skating towards this woman in slow motion. And it used to really give me the creeps big time. Most people have not heard of this movie because it's Canadian, but I highly recommend, if you have not seen it and want to, for nostalgia's sake, go back to 1983, watch the movie Curtains.
My number 4, you actually mentioned already, which is John Badham's other hit that came out the same year.
Oh, wow.
War Games. If you haven't seen it, definitely science fiction. You guys should watch it. It was directed by John Badham, came out on June 3rd, so it was a good summer release there. Matthew Broderick stars as basically a computer hacker, a little computer whiz sort of kid who's used to just doing stuff to change his grades at school and that kind of thing, and ends up hacking into a computer that he thinks is a game. He thinks it's a brand new game that's unreleased yet. But instead, he hacks into the mainframe of a war computer and begins a simulation of destruction, which elevates the intelligence of the computer so much that it does start planning out a real apocalyptic nuclear war. And he has to look up the designer of the game, figure out a way to get in there. It's got some great character work by a lot of the supporting cast.
Ally Sheedy's in it, too.
Yes, she's his girlfriend in it. I remember the general, who is such a great character actor. I can't remember his name right now, but he was so wonderful in it. But Mr. McKittrick, I've come to the definite conclusion that your computer system sucks.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
Well, my number 4, back over in the horror world, I neglected to mention, and I might as well now because of my number 4, that Stephen King was having a heyday in 1983.
Yep.
There were a slew of Stephen King movies, and my number 4 is Cujo.
Okay.
Cujo is Louis Teague's take on the classic Stephen King novel. I thought it was actually pretty good, but in retrospect and going back and reading what critics say, they didn't like it as much. Do you remember seeing it in the theater? I do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's Dee Wallace driving an old Pinto, goes to a farm to have her car worked on by a mechanic there, and it breaks down. I think that's what happens, isn't it? It
overheats.
I know it breaks down. I can't remember if that's why she went there or not. And her son is asthmatic.
Maybe. I don't remember that.
There's something wrong with him, because after they get trapped there by this dog, this monster dog that has rabies, it's a giant Saint Bernard, the kid comes close to dying. And the mother finally has to get out of the car and face this dog face to face. Now, if you read the book, the kid does not live in the book, but in the movie, they have a happy ending. Anyway, I like this movie. I thought it was pretty good. I haven't seen it in a long time, so don't judge me.
Didn't Louis Teague direct it?
He did.
Yeah.
He did.
I remember that movie, and I remember liking it and taking umbrage with the critics who didn't like it. I thought it was, I remember the book and reading the book and watching the movie both. I thought it was King's, other than his short stories, it was his first attempt at something so basic and so normal that can be so terrifying. Because it's not just Cujo. It's what happens if you are locked in a car and you cannot roll down the windows because the dog
it's hot, yeah.
And it becomes 120 degrees in there. And what do you do? How do you survive? And it was such a, it's such a normal thing that became horrifyingly real, sort of thing. And I thought Dee Wallace did a great job.
Well, and it was Dee Wallace in her prime. I mean, it was the year after E.T., but it was at that time where she was just in everything genre-wise. I mean, she did The Howling. Oh, she was in Critters.
Especially because I waffled on this one, 3 and 4, 3, 4, 3 and 4. But my number 3 is Videodrome, which is very science fiction, but also very horror. But just because it's body horror, it's Cronenberg. Cronenberg always does body horror. It came out February 4th. Cronenberg both wrote and directed it. It cost $5 million to do this movie. It grossed 2.9. So it was a huge, horrible bomb. But
it was also Canadian, wasn't it? I think.
It was a Canadian production. But I thought the storyline, although it gets really convoluted when it gets all that political stuff near the end, but before that was terrifying, but also really a science fiction plot, a science fiction theme of television could manipulate you.
Cronenberg was ahead of his time as far as gore and body horror and all that stuff.
And cinematically, the whole put a video cassette into your stomach sort of, and then pull a gun out, the screen coming to life and pushing through the screen, almost poltergeistish sort of thing. I mean, a lot of that stuff was really, really interesting.
Interesting that you chose sort of a sci-fi horror hybrid for your third movie, because I did the same.
Beat 'em or burn 'em. They go up pretty easy.
I chose Twilight Zone, the movie. And basically it has science fiction stories as well as horror stories in it. It was a movie put together, I think, by Spielberg, but he did one of the segments along with John Landis, Joe Dante, and George Miller. Basically what they did was brought back some old Twilight Zone nostalgia by doing 4 separate stories connected by bookends, I guess you would say.
An anthology movie.
Yeah, it was an anthology movie. And you know how much I like anthology movies.
Me too.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think 3 of the stories were actually old episodes redone, and that one was a new one. Maybe the Landis one. The movie is kind of marred by history and time and it was controversial because of some actors' death on the set.
Vic Morrow.
Vic Morrow was killed by a helicopter. And I think a child was killed too, wasn't he?
2 children he was carrying. Kids.
Okay. He and 2 kids were killed. So this movie kind of got a big slash across it in history. I don't know how many people remember that.
The movie's great. The incident was horrible and led to Landis's depression and it was a lawsuit. It was a huge lawsuit that went on for months and really examined Hollywood practices of safety and how they did stuff and everything else. But the movie itself, like you said, is really strong and has some great performances in it.
Right.
Joe Dante's I do think that I remember, because I'm like you, I haven't seen it in a few decades, but I think each story is very telling of the director of that story. Like Joe Dante's has the puppets and the weird caricatures and the strangeness and the weird shadows and colors. Spielberg's is very sentimental about people at an old folks home and blah, blah, blah. You know?
And then George Miller amps up Nightmare at 20,000 Feet.
Yes.
And instead of William Shatner, he cast John Lithgow to take over that role. And that one's probably my favorite of all of them, of course.
Yeah. Dante is the one that does the remake of It's a Good Life. It's a Good Life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The one where I'm sending you to Cartoon Land.
My number 2, again, might surprise you just because it's my number 2 instead of my number 1. But again, I went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it is Return of the Jedi. You cannot do Star Wars in 1983 without Return of the Jedi.
I agree, but I thought you hated that movie.
I don't like this movie. I didn't say it was a good movie. I just said it was a notable movie for 1983, which is kind of what I had to do for my criteria. It was huge. It ended the trilogy, excised the Ewoks. It might even actually be an interesting kind of movie. It does do great with ending the Skywalker saga until J.J. Abrams decided to resurrect and destroy it almost.
It's one of those I'm pretty sure I saw about 4 or 5 times in the theater.
Oh, yeah. I did too. I really loved all of the Darth and Luke stuff and the can I turn him from darkness sort of angle of it. However, they screwed it up with Ewoks and oh, my dad's just an old man.
You want to live in a treehouse.
No, but I would hang out. And also gave us the iconic for, geek boys all over the world, the iconic gold bikini for Princess Leia, which has become a trope for decades. So there you go. That's my number 2.
Why are you torturing me like this?
Well, my number 2 is actually a sequel.
What? Mine was 2, but it was a...
Oh, that's right. It sure was. Sorry.
Duh.
Duh. Well, mine was Psycho 2.
Really?
I love that movie, and I thought you did too, because I seem to remember seeing it with you at a theater.
Wait, isn't that the one where we find out all about his history with mom and all that?
A little bit. It's basically...
it's him getting out and trying to rehabilitate, right?
Right. We have Anthony Perkins, who has served his time and has been released on good behavior. But it also brought back Vera Miles from the original movie as well. Vera Miles played Janet Leigh's sister, and Janet Leigh was the person that Norman Bates killed in the original Psycho. I thought this movie was a lot of fun. It was directed by Tom Holland, who was really hot at the time. He did Fright Night, and then later on went on to do Child's Play, which is the Chucky franchise. So we know him from those horror movies. And I thought Perkins literally chewed the scenery up in this movie like Jack Nicholson. He was just very, very good in it. And it had plot twist you weren't expecting. And one of my favorite scenes that is still to this day one of my favorite scenes in a movie, when he whacks that woman over the head with a shovel.
He's making the peanut butter sandwich, right?
He's making something in the kitchen. She's sitting down at the table like they're having tea, and he just casually picks up a shovel and turns around and knocks her on the head with it so damn hard, and it's so unexpected that I've never forgotten it.
Oh, yeah. They're right in the middle of a conversation, and it's so light and polite and nice and blah, blah, blah. And he goes, would you like another, Okay, drum roll. So number 1 for me, science fiction, number 1, ironically not Return of the Jedi for that year, but a movie that I tend to like a great deal. Some people don't. It's a very divided sort of thing, but I think it's a really well done, well-made movie. And it's called Brainstorm.
Yeah.
I loved this movie. I saw it several times. I ended up I think they did the novelization after it. Directed by Douglas Trumbull, who was a big effects guy. I mean, from 2001 through all of the Star Wars. He had worked on this for years and years on the screenplay and everything. It's a great story, a great science fiction premise of what would happen if you could actually record people's dreams, record people's thoughts, record people's experiences. So this is the ultimate VR headset in 1983. It not only gave you the visuals of what a person wearing the initial headset and recording it saw, but what they felt, how fast their heart beat, how they breathed, did they sweat, what they smelled, all of that. And it could be replayed. And it covers so much of the implications of that technology and how destructive or positive it could be. Even down to the one guy who's addicted to sex. So naturally, they find him almost catatonic because he's been orgasming for 3 days. Sort of thing. Then, of course, the military applications and the big cosmic deal about it at the end is the lead scientist, who is dying of a heart attack, puts the headset on and records it. And that tape becomes the big black box tape of we've got to get a hold of that, because it would literally have a person re-experience what it's like after death. And ironically, speaking of after death, this was Natalie Wood's last movie. This was celebrating the filming of this movie was when she died on the yacht with Christopher Walken and her husband at the time.
Robert Wagner.
And that kind of like your Vic Morrow thing. I think that's interesting.
I was going to say the exact same thing. This movie was kind of marred by the death of a celebrity.
Yeah, very much so. And taken way too soon, because I think Natalie Wood's always been amazing. I've loved her in everything.
She's a wonderful actress.
Good. I really loved this movie. It's my favorite movie of this year.
Oh, wow. And it's been a long time since I've seen it, but I remember liking it too.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, my number one is going to venture back into two territories we've already been in. One is Stephen King, and one is David Cronenberg, and it is The Dead Zone.
Very underrated, I think. Movie.
I think this is a super underrated movie. I think it's one of David Cronenberg's best movies.
Yes.
It's his take on the classic King story. It also stars Christopher Walken, who was in Brainstorm, and Martin Sheen. It's one of those where they kind of flip it. You would normally see Christopher Walken play a bad guy and Martin Sheen play a good guy, but it ends up being Christopher Walken's the good guy and Martin Sheen's the bad guy.
Yeah.
I think it's probably one of the best early Stephen King adaptations, because there was a lot of shit coming out based on Stephen King books in the 80s. And this one was high up as far as being good. It's not really a horror movie, but I don't know how else you would classify it. So since it's Stephen King, it kind of gets lumped in there. And it's about Johnny Smith, who has an accident that he wakes up from a coma and has telekinesis. Not telekinesis. What is it?
No, he's psychic visions, premonitions.
Yes, exactly. And he loses 5 years of his life, and the woman he's in love with has married someone else. And
of course,
he's basically kind of been, totally dumped on by the world because of the situation he's in. And when he touches people, he can predict the future and what that person may do. And he happens to shake a small-town political candidate's hand and realizes this guy's going to be the president and blow up the world by starting
a nuclear war. He's going to start war games.
Yes, exactly. So the whole idea is, if you could shoot Hitler because you knew what he was going to do, would you, go ahead and assassinate a future presidential candidate?
The struggle that Johnny has to deal with, first of all, being so abandoned and so lost in the new world, but also this gift. Is it a gift or a curse? And can he change it, or is it immutable? Is he just seeing, a picture of the future and that's what it's going to be, or can he change it? And then finally, when he realizes, yes, he can change it. And then this happens, it's like, but should I? And you get into that whole moral dilemma. And does that make me crazy? Because no one's going to believe me. Yeah. Because there's no way you could possibly defend your actions to people who can't see the future.
Another thing great about this movie is the cast, the supporting cast.
Oh, yeah.
Because not only have you got Martin Sheen and Christopher Walken, you've got Tom Skerritt playing the sheriff. You've got Herbert Lom playing, I think, like one of his psychiatrists. You've got Brooke, I can't think of her last name. Brooke Adams, was that it maybe?
Oh, I think you're right.
Yeah, she was great. I mean, it just has it's got that guy from that Canadian actor, I can never remember his name, that plays Frank Dodd, that ends up putting his head like this and ramming his face down on a pair of scissors. That's one really true David Cronenberg moment of that movie. But anyway, it's still one of my favorites. And obviously I've seen it several times. That's why I remember all those scenes. So.
Yes. Excellent.
So that's my number one.
Those were some good choices. Did you? I know I had like 2 or 3 honorable mentions. Did you have any?
My honorable mentions also feature a lot of King and Cronenberg. And my first honorable mention was Videodrome, the one that you've already covered. Okay. But I also thought Christine, which is a John Carpenter movie based on a Stephen King novel.
Wow.
That came out that year, and I love John Carpenter, and that's a pretty damn good movie, but it does deviate from the book enough that I just could not put it in my top 5.
I'd agree.
And then Sleepaway Camp is another one that is basically another Friday the 13th ripoff, but it is a cult film due to its controversial ending. I don't know if you remember this, but the killer Angela is actually her brother Peter, who was thought to be dead, and it's revealed in a nude scene at the end. So the killer ends up being trans, I guess you would say. It was very controversial at the time, and that is why this movie is remembered, and it is the only reason why I mention it. It's not one of my favorites, really, but it is worth mentioning.
My first one was directed by Peter Yates. This is a guy who did Bullet, The Deep, Breaking Away, The Dresser, a great storyteller, everything. And he ended up doing a little film called Krull.
I remember that.
And I remember it had huge marketing and everybody went to see it and everything. It had the glaive, which was like this round circle with 3 blades that came out of it and you would throw it. The other one I know you've heard of as well too. And I ended up doing some research on this and going, oh my gosh, now I've got to find it and watch it. Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin. Directed by Charles Band. I mean, we all knew his name in the 80s. I mean, that was a big deal.
Robo-Jocks.
That movie was, I mean, so derivative of like, Death Race 2000 and all of these Miller-inspired movies.
There were so many of those those Mad Max knockoffs around then.
Yeah. And I guess my last honorable mention is one to redeem myself for those two. Was a movie that almost made my top 5, but it was a television movie, so I kind of pulled it away because of that. But it was called The Day After. It was a huge deal, huge marketing campaign. Basically, it was the story of Lawrenceville, Kansas, which happens to be a little small city near a bunch of nuclear silos in the Midwest of the United States. And this is a movie about what happens when World War III happens. So the aftermath of the initial nuclear onslaught, should the Russians and the United States, or I guess now, should any of the superpowers decide to launch missiles on each other, what will happen? It's extremely depressing, has a great cast, because the whole beginning is, of course, set up and exposition, all that. But once the bombs fall, there are no commercial interruptions for the next 90 minutes.
Wow.
It's straight. It was very interesting. It was a very cool, and I still remember that. It was based on a British miniseries on BBC called Threads.
Right.
And that's really where they took a lot of the core elements of it, of an aftermath of a nuclear attack.
I think we actually talked about both these movies on another top 5, like Apocalyptic Edition.
We probably did.
Yeah, we did. I just wanted to mention a few other movies that were out in 1983 just to give some perspective.
Yeah.
The House of Long Shadows. Do you remember that?
Oh, I do. Yeah, I saw it at
that
the Christmas
was like
theater.
One of those attempts to bring back all the classic horror movie actors that were still alive, including John Carradine, Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing.
Yep.
I don't remember that movie at all, so I have a feeling it's not very good, but thought I'd bring it up. There's a movie called Spasms with Oliver Reed and Peter Fonda.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen it. If I have, it's been a long time, and I really want to see it again.
I think I saw that at the drive-in, actually. Yeah, I do think I saw Spasms. Yeah.
The Hunger, which was one
David Bowie
you loved.
Yep.
That was about vampires. Not one of my favorites. It was a little slow for me, but it did have David Bowie, Susan Sarandon, and Catherine Deneuve. Something Wicked This Way Comes.
Yes, that's on my list.
That year. Jonathan Pryce and Jason Robards. And then there was a slew of 3D movies, including Jaws 3D and Amityville 3D.
We're going back to the 50s, baby. We're bringing back 3D.
We were. The Keep came out that year.
Yeah, good one.
That was the Michael Mann version of the F. Paul Wilson book. Loved the book. Hated the movie.
Hated the
movie. Ian McKellen and Scott Glenn in it. Not good.
Terrible movie.
Yeah. And then Mausoleum, which is just one of those movies that Steve Rowe and I would watch a lot because it was terrible.
The Right Stuff came out in 1983. One of my favorite movies.
Oh, cool.
But not science fiction at all. It's science fact, baby. This is how we did it. This was the original Mercury and Gemini astronauts.
Very, very cool.
Thank you for doing this. This was fun. We have to pick a new year next.
Yeah, I think we're going to keep doing this because I like going back and time capsulizing the genres in years.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fun.
Yeah. it's a
So
lot
if
of
you're
fun.
out there watching or listening and you think of a year you want to challenge us with, just give us a year and we'll try it and see what we can come up with horror and science fiction of that year. Yeah.
Yeah. And until next time.
You can't start the car. Johnny has the keys.